Hello everyone and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Helling. The look of our money has been given a makeover. In recent years, several bills have been redesigned and given a new look, mostly for security reasons. The U.S. Treasury this past week announced some of the most sweeping and historically symbolic changes in a century for our currency, starting with replacing former President Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill with Harriet Tubman, the former slave and abolitionist.
It's time for women to be back on our paper currency.
This past week, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew decided it will be Harriet Tubman who will bump Andrew Jackson to the back of the 20. She will be the first African-American honored on paper currency and the first woman since Martha Washington's portrait briefly graced the $1 silver certificate more than a century ago. Tubman escaped slavery and led hundreds of other slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. And then in later years, she joined the women's suffrage movement.
She didn't stop working to promote democracy in this country, for the entirety of her life.
Tubman's relatives couldn't be prouder.
To share the blessing and have it be acknowledged for real, to the point that they got to one of those, green things that we call money. That's awesome.
To see her on the bill is going to remind people that anything is possible. Maybe the next little kid might look up and say, I want to do something that's going to change and impact the world, and maybe I'll be on the 50.
Originally, Treasury Secretary Lew was considering replacing Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. But then came along an award-winning Broadway musical that changed everything. The smashing success of Hamilton brought newfound fans of the Founding Father who rallied around the first Treasury Secretary turned pop icon. Lew reconsidered and agreed to keep Hamilton on the front of the 10 and replace Jackson instead.
Alexander Hamilton is one of my heroes. He's not leaving our money. We're going to put a woman on the face of our currency. And this is not just about the $10 bill. This is about a whole series of bills.
Lew says when the new bills are redesigned, a scene of women from the suffrage movement will go on the back of the $10 bill. And on the flip side of the $5 bill, the Lincoln Memorial would remain as the backdrop for images of Marian Anderson, an African-American classical singer who performed there in 1939 after she was turned away from the segregated Constitution Hall nearby. She would be joined by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who arranged that performance at the Lincoln Memorial, and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who during a march in 1963 delivered his I Have a Dream speech from its steps. There's no time set for when the new bills will be issued, but the Treasury Department has said it will redesign the front of the 20 with Harriet Tubman's face in place of Andrew Jackson by 2020. And Martha Swan with John Brown Lives is here with us. Nice to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Many are applauding the decision to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. No decision on a timetable just yet, but is the hope that this is going to focus new attention on the abolitionists and the Underground Railroad movement?
I think it already has. It's generated such an exciting and important conversation. People have been working to get a woman on the 20 for, I don't actually know how long, but for quite some time. And certainly in the Harriet Tubman women's community, this is a very, very exciting development. And the conversation that it has engendered already online, in the newspapers, in classrooms, is here to stay.
Do you think a lot of people are looking at Harriet Tubman now who maybe aren't familiar with her history and suddenly discovering what she's all about?
Absolutely. Although I was told that there was a survey done not so long ago that she was is one of the most widely recognized people in our history. However, it's sort of a scratch and sniff knowledge. People associate her with slavery, with freedom, with Underground Railroad, and that's about it. We have a project called Harriet Was Here. It's a pilot project of a larger program called In My Backyard, Geographies of Slavery and Freedom. And the goal, the mission of this project was to approach how we learn and teach history differently, particularly the history of slavery. I think we're still wedded in the North to think about slavery as a Southern institution. We're increasingly acknowledging that slavery existed in New York, that slavery existed in the North, that it built our economies, that it built our roads, and so on and so forth. We're beginning to come to recognize that and give it its due in the telling of our history. However, I think there's still this prevailing notion that our history, the history of slavery, the story of slavery, there's a demarcation line at the Mason-Dixon line. And it's just false. I think it really, we need a fresh, more inclusive, more critical, and a more complex way of brokering with this history of ours. So through this, we have been connecting teachers and students in northern and southern schools around the life of an individual, and the first individual we chose was Harriet Tubman. And so students in Maryland, where she was born, students in Auburn, where she lived most of her life, students in the Adirondacks because of her friendship with John Brown, students now in St. Catharines, Ontario, where that was where the North Star led her, where safety and refuge during the era of slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act, where she fled, where she settled her family, where she left to return to the States, return south, and bring more people out of slavery. We're connecting all of these places in her life, and kids are doing the research. They're finding out about Harriet in their backyard, literally, and they're getting well beyond the sort of superficial knowledge of her as an Underground Railroad icon. And it's fascinating and so inspiring what the kids are learning. And, Harriet's life was so rich. She was such an extraordinary woman, scout, spy, conductor on the Underground Railroad. So the connections in Delaware, South Carolina, Philadelphia, across New York State. If we had the funding, we could go up and down the seaboard and into Canada. So we're hoping to do that.
Next weekend, you're holding your annual John Brown Day at the State Historic Site in North Elba near Lake Placid. And this year you are giving out a new award, the Spirit of John Brown Freedom Award. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
We're very, very excited. John Brown Lives was founded in 1999. And a year ago, one of our board members, Dr. Hadley Krutzig-Aaron from SUNY Potsdam, she brought to us the idea of establishing an award in John Brown's name. So our board embraced the idea immediately, and we decided on this language of Spirit of John Brown Freedom Award, which would recognize someone living amongst us, or in this case, one of our awardees is recently deceased, who really exemplifies and embodies and lived a life of action. Action, action, action was one of John Brown's mottos. Lived a life of action on behalf of, as John Brown might have put it, the poor and despised among us. So it's in this spirit that we are giving this award to actor, activist, international humanitarian Danny Glover, to civil rights, criminal justice scholar and activist Alice Green from Albany, and our beloved Brother Yusuf Abdul Wasi Burgess, who was a member of our board and involved with John Brown Lives since the very beginning, who died too young in December of 2014.
There will also be a performance at this year's John Brown Day by Magpie, a husband and wife duo from the Catskills down in the small village of Middleburg in Schoharie County, who have traveled and worked tirelessly as performers with school kids and at reenactments to raise awareness about John Brown.
Greg and Terry are two extraordinary people, again, who live by the motto of action, 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 make my life worth living. And as musicians and as songwriters, they are tireless. They've performed a number of times for us, with us. They have been artists in residence. They did an artist residency a couple of years ago in the Ausable Valley School with fourth graders, writing a song about Timbuktu. They've been to the Newcomb School, working with the kids to write songs about John Brown and Harriet Tubman. And they They are the artists in residence working with us on the Harriet Was Here project. So Monday, I think, next week, before John Brown Day, they will be in Auburn working with the kids there to craft a new song about Harriet Tubman. And then they'll be with us on Saturday. Sunday morning they get on the road and they head to St. Catharines, and they'll be with the school children in St. Catharines for a week, writing a new song. So to date, I think they have worked with students where we have something like nine or 10 original songs with some aspect of Harriet Tubman's life that probably most of us didn't know about.
John Brown obviously is still one of the most controversial figures in American history. There's been the fierce debate over whether he's a hero and martyr or whether he's a fanatic and terrorist. A century and a half now after his execution, is there growing consensus among historians and scholars about him and his life?
Probably not. Probably not consensus. But I think the conversation has moved somewhat, and we're trying to help with that. You know, there's been probably in the last 10 years many more books written about Brown that are certainly many more books which are more comprehensive, more nuanced, so forth. But I think we're probably a long way from consensus. And I think that the more the country knows, the more that the country knows about what slavery was, the brutality, systematic violence, terror, and horror that slavery was, then perhaps as a society we'll be able to judge John Brown more fairly than we have.
With new polls showing a growing number of Americans worried about race relations in the U.S., is John Brown's story still very relevant today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Why? For many reasons. One, again, if we look at who John Brown was and why, he really turns the narrative, the supposition that race is a black issue, which is kind of how we've treated it historically, right? And even today, if we look at, oh, well, here was this white man who was not only an abolitionist who abhorred slavery, but he believed in the equality of all people. If we look at that and begin to cross-examine his contemporaries and society at his time, it really obliges us to recognize that neither then nor now was race a black issue and not a white issue.